Welcome to the third module of this course. In this module, we shall go through the rights and duties of the data principal. Data principal, just like a consumer is the king, data principal is the king under this legislation. He has various rights, but he also has duties under this legislation. In the previous slides and modules, we have understood who is a data principal. Simply is an individual to whom the personal data belongs to, and where the individual is a child, the parent or the guardian of such child becomes the data principal. Now, before we get into what are the specific rights and duties of the data principal, let us also look at what is personal data and how it is defined under the legislation, along with some other definitions in relation to data. The personal data under this legislation is given a very wide meaning. It is defined to mean any data about an individual, and the data itself is defined to contain any information, facts, concepts, opinions or instructions. So, put together, the definition of personal data and data has a very wide connotation. There is no attempt in this legislation to specifically tell that these are the personal data or these are sensitive personal data. It has been captured in a manner that it gives the widest definition possible, and therefore the companies and corporates who are dealing with the personal data of individuals should be careful that any aspect of information with regard to an individual they are touching, that becomes a personal data that they are managing and will be responsible under this legislation. The other important definition is the personal data breach. So, any unauthorized processing of the personal data, that is, you process the data without the consent of the individual, or even an accidental disclosure that compromises the confidentiality and integrity, that shall become a personal data breach. It is not that you will intentionally breach their data. Any accidental disclosure by the data fiduciary of the personal data can also result in a breach and attract heavy fines and penalties under this legislation. So, therefore, in the context of the personal data, it is essential to know that it carries a very wide definition, and the corporates and companies have to take adequate measures to ensure that the data processing is in line with the requirements of the legislation. The data principal gets a variety of rights under this legislation that he can exercise. One right is the basic right of right to information about the personal data. So, the data principal can ask the data fiduciary to provide him with certain information, and the data fiduciary is bound to give such information to the data principal. The data principal can seek information from the data fiduciary in relation to the data that is being processed or is being processed or already processed, and summary of the various processing activities in respect to personal data. So, you can ask the data fiduciary as to what you are doing with my data. Not only can he ask about the activities that are being carried about in relation to his data, but the data principal can also ask the data fiduciary as to whom all his data is being shared with. So, if I have given my information to the bank to open my bank account, I can, as a data individual, as a data principal, ask the bank as to where all my data is going and which data processors and which other data fiduciaries has the data been shared with, and the data fiduciary is obligated to share the information, and any other information as may be prescribed once the legislation takes a better shape. I guess a variety of other information will also be prescribed as to what the data principal can ask the data fiduciary. So, one fundamental right given under this legislation is I can know as an individual from the data fiduciary as to what is happening to my data that I have given to the data fiduciary. The second important right that the data principal gets under this legislation is the right to correction and erasure of the personal data. So, whenever the data principal comes across his data not being accurate or needs any correction, he can make that request to the data fiduciary, and data fiduciary is obligated and bound to make that correction once the request is received from the data principal. The data principal can ask for correction of any inaccuracy in data, or completion of any incomplete data or any updation to his personal data, there is changes to his personal data, his email IDs can change, his address can change, or any other information can change. And whenever there is an updation required for that personal data, the data principal has the right, I have the right to go to the bank and tell them that please make these corrections, or I should be provided a forum online where I can make the corrections happen. And whenever some data is not required, the data principal can ask the data fiduciary to erase this data. So, if I am doing away with the bank account, I can tell the data fiduciary, I do not want you to retain my information, and the bank is obligated to erase my information from their online systems. The data principal is also entitled to grievance redressal, and the data fiduciary is bound to have a grievance officer who can address my queries and concerns. And if the data principal is not satisfied with the response of the data fiduciary, the data principal has the right to approach the data protection board to ensure that his requirements are met. The data fiduciary, the companies and corporates, therefore need to have systems in place, the resources in place, the grievance officers in place to ensure that whenever there is a request for any information by the data principal, those requests are met. Whenever there is a request for correction, changes, update or erasing of the data, there is a requirement of resources, time and effort from the data fiduciaries to ensure they comply with it. They also need a grievance redressal forum within their organization which can address the grievances raised by the data principal. The data principal also gets the right to nominate somebody else who will be the data principal in order to exercise the right in the event of the death of the data principal, or there is an incapacity in terms of where the data principal is not able to exercise the rights. Though the data principal is the king under this legislation, not that he only gets the rights without any duties. The data principal also has certain duties that he has to take care of in his role as a data principal. Some of the significant duties that he has is to comply with the provisions of the law while he is exercising his rights. So, he should not give any false, fake, frivolous information or raise a frivolous complaint or raise a frivolous grievance against the company. So, he should not be approaching the board at the drop of the hat. So, no false complaint, frivolous complaint shall be entertained by the board. One of the major responsibilities or duties of the data principal is also that he should not be furnishing any false information or supply any information that is inaccurate, knowingly inaccurate, or suppress any kind of material information. And he should furnish only such information whose authenticity can be verified. So, the data principal gets a set of rights in terms of seeking of information from data fiduciary, seeking for changes to the information, grievance redressal, and nominate any other person who will act as a data principal. Along with these key rights, he also has the duty to ensure that he complies with the legislation, provides accurate information, does not raise any false or frivolous complaints or claims with the data board, and ensures that the data provided by him is verifiable by the legislation. We come to the end of module 3 where we discuss the rights and duties of the data principal. In the next module, we shall go through the duties and obligations of the data fiduciary.